Newly unearthed documents today reveal what really happened in Tiananmen Square, Beijing in 1989, how the protests were prepared, how teams caused them to escalate, and how they really came to an end. And they provide the most detailed account yet about one of the biggest hoaxes in modern history. One so successful that the perpetrators, an ocean away, later boasted on YouTube of being the ghosts in the machine, the ones who were pulling the strings in what was erroneously reported about things that happened or didn't happen in Beijing. Key points: there was no Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. US units started training Chinese protesters in 1988. Their cover was a NED-financed magazine publishing group in Beijing. The CIA provided well-equipped officers for anti-government activists to create a movement. US military psyops specialists trained protesters in Hong Kong to escalate street battles, and the US gave places in Harvard and Princeton, etc., to cooperative student leaders. And after June the 4th, the fictional story of 10,000 killed as soldiers machine gun students was distributed by US, UK, and Australian diplomats. But many consul staff and journalists knew the massacre never happened before the end of that first week. Now, the documents on which this report is based were gathered by a group of Hong Kong people working with the present writer. Now, the documents were not stolen or hacked. They're technically public access documents, but they're not easy to find and assemble, which is why the full story has not been told before. Now, this material reveals the existence of a generously financed operation involving the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, researchers in protest escalation, and the US Army specialist in psychological warfare, or psyops. The story really begins not in 1989, but in 1988, with three things happening. First, a Chinese language journal called The Chinese Intellectual opened an office in Beijing to publish a quarterly magazine of essays for distribution in major cities of China. Second, a retired American Army colonel reportedly flew from the United States to Hong Kong. He was being secretly monitored by an Indian counter-terrorism agent. We'll get to them later. And third, an American university professor who ran an organization called the Albert Einstein Institution in the United States took an interest in China and casually predicted protests there. Okay, nothing too controversial on the face of it, but look more closely and alarm bells start to go off. First, most journals in East Asia ran at a loss on tiny budgets of a few $100s. Present writer knows, having run one himself. But the Chinese intellectual was astonishingly wealthy, with a budget of between $130,000 and $235,000 per year. Where did those huge sums come from, and what were they being spent on? Second, the staff from this Beijing-based publication were from the US, and they didn't just edit essays, they organized public events which drew in the people of the city to discuss politics, particularly young people. What were they being prepared for? Third, anyone who went through the records of the Albert Einstein Institute, or AEI, would find it had literally nothing to do with the scientists of that name, or physics, or even science. It was founded in 1983 as a US operation collecting and generating strategies to destabilize foreign governments through street protests. The man who ran it, Dr. Gene Sharp, had his specialty listed on documents: coup d'etat, which is French for overthrowing governments. Next, follow the money. By tracking funding sources, we learned that the suspiciously rich journal, which has started in Beijing, was funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED. Now, that's a body first proposed in a document written by William J. Casey of CIA fame. He was proud of his organization's special skill, which is the creation of narratives, fake narratives, so as to enable mass deception. I mean, he's famous for saying, "We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." After being created at the end of 1983, the NED's initial target was China. The endowment's very first grant in 1984 was for the Chinese intellectual. Operative Louisa Cohen would later report in a speech to Congress. Now, the NED was run by a man named Carl Gershman, who wrote in 1987 that his team was working to open closed societies such as China, where the magazine, the Chinese Intellectual, has established a bridge between the reformers and the democratic world. Now, the term reformers clearly refers to pro-Washington activists being cultivated in China, through the magazine publishing unit, which is called China Perspective. Now, the aim was to reform the Chinese out of being Chinese and bring the country into the glorious light of US-style Western liberal democracy. Oh, man. Meanwhile, the Albert Einstein Institute's 5th anniversary document, written by Gene Sharp in, August of 1988, included a curious prediction for the near future. More demonstrations for greater democracy may happen in China, Korea, and many other countries. Since there are roughly 200 countries in the world, this line seems oddly specific as well as oddly vague. Oh, when we mentioned a US Army man on his way to Hong Kong, Colonel Robert Helvey. Now, he's not a tourist. He was an expert in the expanding field at the time of US military psychological warfare, or psyops. And his specialty was making use of young people, youth, students, to escalate street protests into full-scale regime change. Now we move to 1989. By the opening weeks of that year, the Americans had achieved much in growing the anti-government movement right under the noses of the Chinese leadership. One US official would later describe these efforts to a journalist from Canada's Vancouver Sun. For months before the June the 3rd attack on the demonstrators, the CIA had been helping student activists form the anti-government movement, providing typewriters, facsimile machines, and other equipment to help them spread their message. Also, some of the leaders of the nascent anti-government movement in China were reportedly transported to the British Crown colony of Hong Kong for training in protest escalation at the hands of experts from the United States. Yes, we know who. But someone was watching. Keeping an eye on these activities was a senior officer of India's Foreign Intelligence Service. His name was Bahu Kutumbi Rahman. He was head of counter-terrorism activities for India. Now, he was particularly interested in Colonel Robert Helvey's arrival in Asia. Anything which could affect the security of India's neighbours could affect the security of India itself, after all. Rahman later wrote about Helvey in a report. In 1988 to 1989, he also trained in Hong Kong the student leaders from Beijing in mass demonstration techniques, which they subsequently used in the Tiananmen Square incident of June 1989. The Chinese government seems to have realized something strange was happening. On February 6, 1989, the US Embassy sent a cable to Washington in which they listed concerns that the Chinese had raised. One thing the Chinese wanted to do was register concern with US actions perceived as interference in PRC internal affairs. We can find no documents responding to that point. Meanwhile, the team in Beijing and other Chinese cities, the anti-government movement, the activists trained by the CIA and the NED and the psyops specialists were standing by. What were they waiting for? The chosen flashpoint. They needed genuine public grievances, which reached a certain level of intensity. Now, CIA agents felt this was just days away. On February the 9th, 3 days after the Chinese complaint, CIA agents in Beijing wrote a secret report entitled China Potential for Political Crisis. It visualized a situation in which popular discontent sparks widespread student and/or worker unrest. And that's what happened, right? The Western mainstream press said that in April and May of 1989, a massive pro-democracy protest sprang up in Beijing. Now, the way the story was told, the citizens were, oppressed, repressed, people calling for freedom, democracy, and human rights. In fact, the real story was very different. On 15th of April, a popular leader named Hu Yaobang died of a heart attack, and some members of the public mourned on the street. He was a good man, treated badly by some of his rivals, and corruption, people felt, was delaying the implementation of an important policy called the Four Modernizations. But this protest suddenly and unexpectedly escalated. The classic CIA technique has always been to take genuine grievances, whether corruption or extradition or lèse-majesty or whatever, as the flashpoint. They then use their well-polished techniques to grow the demonstrations until they become street battles. And then the media does its job, which is to rebrand whatever they've stirred up as pro-democracy protests. And that's exactly what the press did in April of 1989. This was despite the fact that the protesters were really patriotic Communist Party supporters calling for purer, stronger socialism. They carried pictures of Chairman Mao and sang the Chinese national anthem repeatedly. Now, 2 days after Hu's death, organised groups of thousands of students marched in from several universities, all on the same day, arriving in Tiananmen Square. And that evening they handed out a joint list of 7 demands. Not one less. Remind you of anything? Yeah, Hong Kong, Bangkok, almost everywhere else the US has escalated demonstrations into street fights. Meanwhile, the CIA reportedly had a network of informers among the students who led the protest. So, of course, they knew exactly what was happening moment by moment. The US State Department had by this time withdrawn US Ambassador Winston Lord and replaced him on May the 8th with James Lilley, a veteran CIA agent. Sharp-eyed observers noted that the original banners after Hu's death in April were in Chinese, but later banners were written up in English, calling for democracy. For example, one said, "Give me democracy or give me death." Now that's a pastiche of a 1775 US saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." The protesters were advised to create a statue and began work on May the 27th. But as good socialists, the students chose to make it as unlike New York's realistic Statue of Liberty as possible, basing the statue on the highly stylized work of Russian revolutionary communist sculptor Vera Mukhina. On the 22nd of May, new US Ambassador James Lilley wrote to Washington, "A confrontation resulting in bloodshed is probable at this point." Indeed, Ambassador Lilley's words seem to anticipate the narrative about a crackdown against pro-democracy campaigners. And this was 2 weeks before that story was actually launched. But he was wrong. There was no violent crackdown. Things remained calm. Now, a week later, on 28th of May, Dr. Gene Sharp, America's self-claimed expert at compiling methods to escalate street protests into coup d'etat, flew into Beijing with his assistant Bruce Jenkins. Now, Sharp portrayed himself as a casual visitor conducting research. He spent time with one of the student leaders, a man named Li Lu. But the truth is that Sharp had been long associated with Colonel Robert Helvey, and they'd worked together since at least 1987, both being based at the same place in Harvard University at the same time, both focusing on transforming innocent protests into upheavals that would lead to regime change. Yet those final days of May highlighted a problem for the Americans. There was still no violence, either from the students or from the government. It was as if the Chinese were just less prone to smashing up buildings than protesters in the West and other places. Might be true. Worse still, from the US point of view, the Chinese students wanted to go back to studying. No. As May turned into June, the energy level dropped and it looked like the whole thing was calming down. What to do? The US reportedly contacted key leaders among the protesting students and made them an offer. Don't wind down, keep going, go harder on the protesting, and we'll give you US passports, CIA-run safe passage out of China, a new home in the richest country in the world, and enrollment in top US universities in Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, name it. That was an offer hard to refuse. In late May, student leader Chai Ling gave her infamously puzzling interview where she predicted she would soon die in a Tiananmen Square massacre. She said she was speaking her last words, as there would be, quote, "a massacre which would spill blood like a river through Tiananmen Square." But she also included the information that she would not be there, as her new plan was to move to the United States to study in that country. Now, years later, she wrote that her remarkable prediction of a coming violent crackdown in the square, which would lead to a massacre, was something she had heard from someone else, from Li Lu, not her own forecast. Another person in the leading student group, Kong Qingdong, later recalled how he had come across undergraduates using a mimeograph machine to make copies of personal documents to give to the US Embassy in return for passports. Now, two of the top leaders, Chai Ling and Feng Kongde, were getting them, he was told, by those undergraduates. Now, Kong was angry. He declined to join them. He later said, "I wasn't fond of the way the forceful way the government spoke, but what they were actually saying was, this is a complex situation. There are certain forces behind the scenes sowing discord." this was the truth. Think about that line of agreement between the students and the government. There are certain forces behind the scenes sowing discord. In other words, protesters as well as the government knew what was really happening under the surface. But if things were coming down, what changed? How did violence finally break out? Now, Kong's answer to that question was cryptic. When we were little, we watched movies like Gorillas Sweep the Plain, he said. Now, that answer would have meant nothing to a Western audience, but it was very clear to many Chinese people. Now, this was a reference to a classic 1955 Chinese movie in which there are tensions between two groups. They have disagreements, but they don't actually fight. Suddenly, a hidden third group, the Eighth Army, opens fire at both sides and then quickly hides, triggering bloodshed. And that seems to be what happened. Soldiers and students were happy sharing food. But on June the 3rd, mysterious thugs, some of whom were said to be from ethnic minorities, triggered a fight in Muxidi in the west of the city. They were attacking army buses with petrol bombs and setting them alight, burning the occupants to death. Now, soldiers who managed to escape the burning buses were beaten to death. Other military men arrived and, infuriated, understandably, at the sight of their slaughtered colleagues, they started shooting at the protesters, who were not students, mostly trade unionists. Chaos broke out with scores of deaths. All this was happening 5 kilometers away from Tiananmen Square. At the square itself, in the early hours of June the 4th, soldiers arrived and called on students to leave. Now, student leader Feng Kongze worked to gauge protesters' opinions and concluded that the majority wanted to vacate the space. So I announced the decision to leave, he said, and the students left peacefully. Now, violence did break out, not in the square, but in the streets around it. Now, this is where it gets strange. The next day, a very different story appeared from a few foreign embassies saying that 10,000 people had been killed. This tale said the students in the square had not left. They'd stayed and been massacred with machine guns. Their bodies were pushed into piles with bulldozers and then incinerated by troops with flamethrowers. This gruesome horror story, supported by no evidence at all, is now viewed by Eastern and Western historians as entirely fictional. Now, rumour said that British Ambassador Alan Donald was a key figure, sending out the fake story. And this was later confirmed when documents were declassified years later and seen to have his name on them. But the same bizarre report was also sent out by the Australian Embassy, delivering similar information in sometimes the exact same words. You know, textual comparison shows that they clearly got the story from the same mysterious unknown source. Each version differed only in details. Now, this was astonishingly different from what actually happened and what the TV cameras showed, which was students peacefully filing out through one of the southern gates, under the leadership of Feng Kongze. How could the invented tale be taken seriously? Well, there was one apparent witness who was repeatedly interviewed by the Western media. This student, Wu Kai-shi, said he could confirm the tale of the Tiananmen Square massacre. He had personally watched the machine gunning slaughter of the hundreds of students, he said. But there was a problem. The other students pointed out that he wasn't even there at the time. He'd left the square hours earlier, and that division of the army had no machine guns anyway. It was later revealed that Wu Kai-shi was actually a US-allied Xinjiang Uyghur named Orkesh Tolet. He was afterwards spirited out of China and taken to the US to be enrolled at Harvard. But back to that first week of June 1989, the narrative had split. The main newsrooms of the international media in London and New York and elsewhere in the West chose to canonize the fictional Tiananmen Square massacre story as a factual record of the end of the protest at that location. The Wall Street Journal coverage was typical. What started 6 weeks ago with student pleas for a little more freedom and a little less repression has climaxed in a display of official violence that ranks almost with the great horrors of Maoist rule. Crude stereotypes with no basis in fact. But that was the media version. Yet it wasn't the tale that eyewitnesses related to each other in Beijing. The massacre story was quite wrong, said Jay Matthews, former Beijing bureau chief for the Washington Post. A few people may have been killed by random shooting on streets near the square, but all verified eyewitness accounts say that students who remained in the square when troops arrived were allowed to leave peacefully. New York Times reporter Nicholas Kristof, a relentlessly bitter critic of China, wrote, "There is no massacre in Tiananmen Square, for example, although there's plenty of killing elsewhere." James Miles, a senior BBC correspondent in Beijing at the time, sat on the real story for years, but finally admitted in 2006 that he had conveyed the wrong impression and that there was no massacre on Tiananmen Square. In 1989, Madrid's ambassador Eugenio Bregalat noted that Western journalists were reporting the non-existent massacre as fact from their hotel guest rooms, while Spain's TVE channel had a television crew physically in the square that evening and knew that it never happened. Within a few days, certainly within a week, it was clear that the information about what happened in the square itself was incorrect. Professor Richard Rigby, a staff member at the Australian Embassy in 1989, years later, told reporters on an ABC News show. At the time, US embassy officials interviewed a Chilean diplomat who had been present in the square and confirmed that he'd seen no Tiananmen Square massacre of any kind. But US officials chose to keep that information secret, allowing the fake story to circulate for decades, until it was exposed by Julian Assange's WikiLeaks operation in 2011. Now, diplomats weren't stupid. They quickly realized that the Tiananmen Square massacre fiction was a black op. That's a term referring to a type of covert operation typically led by the US and often with UK help. Gregory Clark, a British-born Australian diplomat, said, "The mystery report was very likely the work of the US and UK black information authorities, ever keen to plant anti-Beijing stories in unsuspecting or cooperative media." In a book, human rights campaigners George Black and Robin Munro, who are extremely harsh critics of the Chinese government, wrote, "The phrase Tiananmen Square massacre is now firmly fixed in the political vocabulary of the late 20th century. Yet it is inaccurate. There was no massacre in Tiananmen Square on the night of June the 3rd. Even British Ambassador Alan Donald tried to disassociate himself from the embarrassingly unsupported 10,000 dead story. As student leader Feng Congde reported, 3 weeks later, Donald said the true figure was much lower, perhaps 2,700 to 3,400. This was still 10 times higher than the more generally accepted estimates of 200 to 300. And to put this in context, 300 is less than half the number of people who suffer violent deaths in an average week in the US, and far fewer than the numbers of deaths in the US invasion of Panama in 1989, the same year, when American tanks rolled into the country, leaving 516 people dead, according to verified Pentagon records. Consider this passage from Richard Baum's 2010 book, China Watcher, about his friend Peter Gaithner. In a meeting with the Ford Foundation's resident Beijing director, Peter Gaithner, I was surprised to hear him issue a rather spirited defense of the Chinese government's actions on June the 3rd and 4th. Peter spoke of the need to set the record straight concerning the many hyperbolic Western media reports that, he said, had severely inflated the civilian death toll and falsely depicted a massacre of innocent students sitting peacefully in Tiananmen Square. He spent the better part of an hour telling me how such reports had been willfully distorted, how no one had been shot in the square itself. There's the real story right there. But here's the strange thing. Even though every source, including Alan Donald himself, had abandoned the 10,000 killed in Tiananmen Square allegation as clearly wrong, the BBC and other media, AFP, have worked hard for many years to keep it alive. A 2017 BBC headline said, "Tiananmen Square protest death toll was 10,000. At the same time, AFP reported, "At least 10,000 people were killed in the Chinese army's crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square in June 1989, according to a newly released British secret diplomatic cable that gives gruesome details of the bloodshed in Beijing." Yes, they're recycling the debunked fiction, the fiction that everybody debunked. And years later, decades later, they're recycling it. Gregory Clark said, "A major lesson from all this is the need to control our Western black information operators. Few seem to realize the depth of their penetration in Western media." Now let's go back to where we started. Remember the journal called The Chinese Intellectual that opened an office in Beijing in 1988? Well, of course, it was no longer needed. An NED document published after the events of 1989 says that the operation closed its offices in China and moved back to the United States. The NED document added that the staff at the magazine's publishing unit had changed function. The staff has begun providing support for Chinese students in the West who are currently unable for political reasons to return to China. You might think that providing migration advice was an odd thing for a publishing group to do, but nothing about the NED's publishing group made any sense at all. Ling disappeared from sight and then reappeared as a student at Princeton University in the US. Feng Congde much later became a student at the Sorbonne University in Paris, and Li Lu, friend of Gene Sharp, vanished to reappear at Columbia University in the United States. 3 years ago, the US military's psyops division made a TV commercial which starts with strange dark images before an archetypal news announcer's voice fades in.
As the world watches and listens in horror, the peaceful pro-democracy demonstration in China comes to a violent and bloody end.
Then it shows images of shadowy military people in the background and poses a question. Who is pulling the strings? And then it delivers the answer. You'll find us in the shadows. It ends with a web address that takes you to a US military recruitment page for the US psyops department. Hundreds of millions of people will see the stories that US agents feed to Western mainstream media journalists. That's why it's important that people like you and I share the truth. Only that way is there a chance of peace.